These are intimidating. If you think so as well, join me in this sketching practice with pen and ink. We can see tree trunks have a cylinder shape, with the light source coming from the top right-hand corner. The shading would go light to dark as it curves around the subject. To accentuate the form, there's a reflection effect. On the light side, this rim light is a gray value. On the shadow side, it's white. With line work, the gradation would look something like this. There are massive ponderosa pines where I live. All kinds of pines actually, so that's what I'm sketching today. It's challenging, but also exciting to draw from live subjects. I went ahead and sketched another cylinder, but thicker. Then added vertical squiggly lines where the edges of the bark are more prominent. I repeat the shading gradation as I did before, but now rendering with texture. Oh, in case you're wondering, for these exercises, I'm using a mid-range sketching paper. Fine tooth does not destroy pens and has enough fiber for pencil shading too. I like this multi-purpose option for exercises and studies. Then I can save my good bristle paper for inking projects. Where the grooves are deepest, I'm doing a gradation. This communicates the dimensionality of the trunk. Notice the pattern of the bark. I aim to mimic this pattern with vertical squiggles. I bring the marks closer together where it's darkest in the grooves. I'm using a mid-thick tip for this. Then for the raised parts of the bark that are more in the light, I'm using irregular circular hatches to indicate the texture, with a smaller tip size. On the first pass, my grooves appear deeper than the bark in the reference. Also, the contrast is too abrupt, making the trunk appear less tubular. A way to fix this is by smoothing the transitions with midtones. I'm gradually building the tone with additional squiggles between the marks. I chose to render the trunk with lines that follow the form because it suits the reference. If it was a different species like these birch trees, a contour hatching treatment would be more appropriate. What if I change the perspective and add branches? I'd look for the edges of the shape like in the previous drawings. This shape looks flat, but adding texture and shading will give it form. These branches are more complex to draw because of the angles and plane changes, so let's try a different approach. Instead of looking at the edges of the branch shapes, I want to capture the form. It's more like a gesture drawing. To me, the pattern looks like it still follows the form. The smaller branches appear almost black in the reference. In nature, we can observe darker areas under the branches where they connect to the trunk, so I'll do that here as well. Then I layer in the midtones by adding squiggly hatches in between the marks to build up the grays, same as before. This branch here looks black in the reference, but I went too dark for the values in my drawing. I like the out of focus effect it now has in the sketch, but should probably even out the tone and blend the textures without compromising the effect of that odd raised bark with grooves. I built the tone with a tightening of the squiggles without the use of cross-hatching. Moving on to pine cones. These subjects are in two stages of growth, the scales firm on one and grown apart on the other. Notice how the scales are staggered. By simply defining the overall shape and the staggering scales, it's already a pretty convincing cone. How about from a top view? Again, the scales stagger as they overlap. In the first view, the scales are spread further apart at the bottom, which is the opposite effect when you look at the cone from a bird's eye view. The scales are seen in a closer stack as they near the bottom. I like the straight-on viewpoint best, so I'll refine that on the drawing and erase the other. The preliminary doodle helped with establishing the form and the angles. Now I'm establishing the outer edges of the scales. You'll note in the reference how the scales fade to black towards the center stem. For the ink application, I'm first shading the scales using vertical lines going dark to light. From stem to tip, I'm paying attention to the line direction where there are plane changes. This is patient work, even if it's just a steady sketch. I'm shading the scales individually. I switch to my thickest tip pen when that's better for filling in the larger areas of black. My strategy for the needle branch will be to render the clusters of needles that are on top and closest to the viewer. Those will have more definition. I'm using my 03 tip for the foreground needles. It's like a mid-range size tip. With the front needles done, now I'm switching to my smallest tip for the center branch. I'm thickening the shadow side of the top layer of needles so they stand out more. The back row or background needles need to be lighter to create a sense of distance. These needle clusters layered beneath are less defined. We just want to give the illusion of more needles. I'm also mindful not to over-render the background, otherwise the line work turns to mud. I'm just thickening shadows where needles overlap. Now for the pine cone, this one has tighter scales compared to the previous cone study. I'll go ahead and quickly render it in neutral tones using less contrast than I did for the needles. If this were a landscape composition, I'd want the needles to remain prominent as the focal point. I'm relying on the values to create the shape details for the cone so that it feels more abstract compared to the needles, like it's somewhat out of focus, similarly to the branch effect in the earlier study. I'll pull some cast shadows from the needles above and done. Now for the whole tree. For branches, we saw close up they grow in a staggered formation circling the trunk. Top branches point to the sun, then they sag to gravity, moving down the trunk to the ground. The shape is important, even more so when the subject is seen from further away in the picture plane. Shape takes priority over form here because if we can fit a tree that is 130 feet tall onto a page, it's likely going to be smaller than any other element in your composition. That means for drawing it, we switch back to seeking the edges as our visual markers. Then there's clusters of needles on the branches that look like fuzzy balls. Some are in front of the trunk for those branches. The trees from this reference look kind of bare. It's early spring here. The weight of the snow stripped out the dead needles, so I'll just improvise from here, taking cues from some of the other trees in this reference image to fill in my model. I'm going ahead with the ink application from this scribble, starting with the little fuzz balls of pine needles using my smallest tip pen. I've already studied the parts, so now the artistry comes in. I'm repeating the pattern from the previous needle study. We already know that further away means less visible details. In this situation, I use contrast to emphasize the area that provides relevant information. It's like if you were doing an infographic to tell people, hey, this is a pine tree. I'm paying attention to how the light affects the overlapping clusters that cast shadows on the elements below. I continue to build fuzzballs, their shadows, and then pull some branches through. The point of this exercise is to communicate complete information practicing the techniques that can help achieve that with pen and ink. And that concludes my pine study for today. The idea with this process is to work out potential problems and make decisions about rendering effects and style before assembling the parts into a composition. In a future video, I'll create a landscape with trees in a composition for a final project. If you enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate you give it a like, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.